The dark Spanish needle is one of the most curious of North Country spider patterns. It has undergone several changes over the years, with hackles such as owl, starling, swift and water rail often being used. So the purpose of this video is to highlight some of these changes and to later show a step-by-step example of the dressing of the dark Spanish needle. Today we find the first recorded dressing of the dark Spanish needle in John Swarbrick's manuscript under the guise of a pattern called the Spanish needle. Swarbrick's prescribed hackle is taken from between the wing and body of a tawny owl, a hackle being of a dark oak coloration. His manuscript also contains a similar fly dressing called the wood owl, now regularly known as the brown owl, which instead utilises a hackle taken from the centre of an owl's wing, which is a much lighter coloration. And so from the very beginning we can see a clear separation between the dark Spanish needle and its sister pattern, the brown owl, though sadly, as the two fly patterns become copied and redistributed, their dressings often become confused and the hackles merged or substituted. In his manuscript of 1820, Jonathan Pickard gives us the first tangible mention of the dark Spanish needle, and it is this stated dressing and the fly name that flows down through other lists. Later, in his manuscript of 1847, Timothy Thackeray of Otley gives us a dressing called the small Spanish needle, which is in fact the dark Spanish needle, but with Thackeray's substitution of a dark brownish hackle taken from between the body and wing of a starling, a hackle choice which has a similar coloration to Swarbrick's and Pickard's original owl hackles. Later, in 1853, with the publication of his list of angling flies, Michael Theakston gives us a pattern called the needle brown and introduces various possibilities of bright orange or yellow body silks and a combination of hackles which include blow from under a judcock or snipe, or brown from water rail or swift, or blue grizzle from a fieldfare rump. This dressing with its combination of alternative hackles and silks points to it being possibly two patterns rolled into one. Judcock and snipe and fieldfare rump hackles are bluish grey, whilst water rail and swift are dark brown and similar to the originally prescribed owl hackles. Theakston also mentions that on the River Nid this pattern is called the Spanish needle, so it is possible that these two combinations are Theakston's versions of both the dark and light Spanish needle. In 1860 the pattern undergoes another reincarnation with Henry Wade's Spanish needle dressing, which features brown silk instead of the normal orange. Later in 1885, with the publication of Yorkshire trout flies, T.E. Pritt brings the dark Spanish needle to a greater public awareness. However, within the book, Pritt also attaches the name needle brown to the fly, alluding to Theakston's earlier pattern despite the big difference in the two stated dressings. Again, in 1890, the dark Spanish needle undergoes another transformation at the hands of William Bradley, who in his dressing keeps the original owl hackle but substitutes the orange body silk for a deep yellow, an act of possibly combining Pickard and Theakston's earlier patterns. And, as if to complicate things even further, later in 1898, Sylvester Lister sets down another permutation for the dressing of the dark Spanish needle, with his use of dark purple body silk together alongside the traditional orange or copper. Later, in 1916, with the publication of Edmonds and Lee's Brook and River Trouting, we come to the most widely recognised and most orderly dressing of the dark Spanish needle. Here, the two men, mindful of the confusion between the brown owl pattern and the dark Spanish needle, take it upon themselves to drop the use of the traditional owl hackle within the needle dressing, whilst at the same time keeping to Thackeray and Theakston's earlier example of using starling or swift hackles. They also clear up any confusion regarding the correct shade of silk, as in many North Country manuscripts orange silk is often called copper, so they prescribe orange-brown Purcell's No. 6B to take away this confusion. And not content with ditching the traditional owl feather, they also substitute magpie herl instead of the more normal peacock herl, possibly again to increase the separation between the dark Spanish needle and its sister pattern, the brown owl. However, their efforts seem in vain, as in the 1920s, riverkeeper and fly dresser Nat Hunt was dressing his dark Spanish needles with a pink silk. And in 1944, Wharfdale angler and fly dresser Willie Whittaker was dressing his dark Spanish needles with brown silk. And now for an example of the dark Spanish needle. I'm going to demonstrate the tying of Edmonds & Lee's dark needle. For the hook, I'm using a size 14 Airex FW501, which is their dry fly traditional barbless. For the silk, I'm using Purcell's 6B, which is an orange-brown, sometimes called cinnamon. For the hackle, I'm using a dark brownish starling feather taken from where the wing joins the body. There are only about 4 of these on each side of the bird, so you've really got to search these little fellas out. For the head of the fly, I'm using magpie herl, which has got a nice iridescent tinge to it. For the head, I simply cut off 3 or 4 of those magpie herl fibres. Now, to dress the fly, come in with your tying silk directly behind the eye of the hook and trap it down with 3 or 4 nice tight turns. Then come in with your scissors and snip off the waist end. And as with all herl head spiders, we tie the herl in first and simply trap it in with your finger and thumb on top of the hook shank, and then come in with 3 or 4 nice tight turns of silk working back towards the eye. And then once you've trapped it in, bring your silk back down the hook shank again, another 3 or 4 turns. So you've left yourself with a nice area to build up the head of the fly. Trim off any waste end, and either with your fingers or your hackle pliers, take your magpie herl and form the head of the fly. And you only really need 3 or 4 turns is all you need. Once you're happy with the size of the head, come in with your tying silk and again trap that down with 3 nice tight turns, and then trim off the waist end, and there we have our herl head. Now for the hackle, you can see that one side has got a pronounced beige tinge, which we don't want. So what we're going to do is we're going to expose the tip of the hackle, like so, and then the side with the beige tinge, we're just going to simply strip it away. So you're left with bare stalk on one end. And now mount the hackle directly behind that peacock herl head. Simply come in with your silk and trap it down with 3 or 4 nice tight turns of silk. Once you're happy that it's mounted in securely, trim off the waist end. Now take the hackle in your hackle pliers and wind the hackle directly behind the head of the fly, and it's up to you how many turns of hackle you want. I like to come in with 3 or 4 turns. If you're starting to trap down any stray fibres, just simply brush them forward over the head of the fly. That just gets them out of the way for your next turn of hackle. Now, when you're happy with the amount of turns you've got, come in with your silk and trap down that hackle stalk again with 3 or 4 nice tight turns of silk. Trim off the butt end of the hackle, and now you're ready to start and form the body of the fly. And literally with tight touching turns, come down the hook shank to a point somewhere between the point of the hook and the end of the barb. Obviously here it's a barbless hook, so it's basically at the rack of the eye. Probably go one more turn, maybe 2, and I'm happy with that. Now bring your silk in tight touching turns back up the hook shank to a point directly behind where the hackle's been trapped in, like so. Now you form your whip finish immediately behind those hackles. Give it a nice tight pull so it's trapped down. Come in with your scissors and cut off your silk. And now simply fret back those hackles. And there you have Edmonds and Lee's dark needle.